councillors, and welcome to this enthralling workshop on representation. I do apologise for slide 21 in advance. You will, that's the only slide I'm speaking to, and you'll get the full impact of that when we get to slide 21. This workshop will be directed and orchestrated by my colleagues, and very capable colleagues, Brendan Madley here and Tash Port. Tash is the whiz on anything GIS, mapping, data and quantum physics. Terrifying when those are all put together. I'm now going to throw it over to Brendan. Brendan will lead you through the discussion, provide some background as to this process. You'll note that we have brought this process in-house, and I'm quite proud of the fact that this is being managed as a project, given the length and depth and breadth of expertise that we actually have in order to enable the analysis of this, but more importantly, the relevance of it to our local communities. Brendan.
Thank you, Mark. Good afternoon, councillors. Just before I dive into the workshop, just one quick public service announcement with my LTP hat on. I've been asked to pass this along, just to say that elected members, you'll be getting a couple of emails over the next day or two, just discussing availability for the promotional video that we were looking to shoot. That was been discussed previously, I believe, and also for engagement slots, community events and things like that. So just to let you know that that will be coming out. On with the workshop. Does the clicker work? It did work and it is not working. Okay. Off to a good start. So whilst I wait, there we go, perfect. So this is the third workshop that councillors had on the representation review. And the intention of today is to firstly provide an opportunity to recap where we're at and where we're going. Secondly, we want to go on undertake a communities of interest exercise with you. Thirdly, we want to discuss 4 boundary options based on guidance from previous workshops, and we'll discuss that at the time. Fourthly, we aim to do an exercise with you in terms of the number of elected members and how that might influence particular boundaries, representation, effective representation, and the like. And then finally, looking to bring that all together. So just an idea of where we're going over the next hour to hour and a half or so. There's certainly a little bit of information that we need to impart, but the majority of this will be available for discussion, and that's the key thing that we aim to be able to facilitate. So in terms of a bit of a recap, legislatively, council is required to undertake a representation review at least every 6 years, and we are due because the last one was undertaken in 2018. The purpose of the representation review, and this is what everything comes back to, is to facilitate fair and effective representation for individuals and communities. So that is what we are reflecting on, and that is what we are working to achieve. The Local Government Commission provides some focusing questions for councils when undertaking this exercise, and I won't read through all of them, but effectively they're asking questions such as, how might our arrangements provide for better, fair and effective representation? What might have changed in our communities that we need to update our representation arrangements to reflect? And are our current arrangements achieving the sorts of outcomes that you as elected members on behalf of your community want them to achieve? And there's effectively a bit of a process for how those questions might be worked through. Firstly, we figure out what our communities of interest are. Secondly, we figure out how to best represent them effectively, and that's through things such as the number of elected members, whether we have community boards, whether there's an at-large or ward system. And then finally, figure out how to ensure that they're fairly reflected or represented relative to each other. As we go through the process, there are a number of parameters that we are legislatively required to adhere to. So for example, if we have wards, as we currently do, within our district, we can't just draw the lines wherever we want. they are required to adhere to the mesh block boundaries that are set by Statistics New Zealand. Now, those are very granular, so we can draw lines in quite a bespoke way, but to be clear, they have to align with mesh blocks so that they align with the way that Stats NZ reports census data and the like. We are using the latest population estimates from Statistics New Zealand. In the last few months, we've had the 2023 estimated ones be released. So that's an update from the 2022 ones that were being used for last year's workshops. We did go away, see if we could get that census data earlier, which is due to be released in May. The answer, no. So we are using the latest data that's available. And finally, noting that we are, as a council, required to adhere to various legislative timeframes in order to get everything done before next year's local elections. For example, the initial proposal and public notice need to be made by the 8th of September this year. We are, timeframe-wise, in a good space. We do have time up our sleeve. And finally, noting that council, at least as far as the initial and final proposal is concerned, is the decision maker. Community boards have been involved to date through a workshop in November and the like, and we aim to update the community boards at their April meeting on how this process is going. Ultimately, once council goes to the community with a final proposal, there may be appeals on that. The Local Government Commission would then make a final ruling. But at this stage, for the initial and final proposal, council is the decision maker. And just noting the key decisions, not for today, because today is a workshop and we're looking for your discussion and guidance, but ultimately, council is required to resolve for both council and the community boards, if they are indeed retained, firstly, the basis of their election. As I said, are you elected via wards or at large, or a combination of the two, because you can have that? What is the total number of elected members, and if there are wards, how is that split? And then the names and boundaries of each wards. If there are community boards, the same applies to them. Bear with me, sorry. As I've alluded to, in terms of where we're at in the process, this is the third workshop. Moving forward, at some point, we will have an initial proposal that council resolves, that we go to the community on, and we have at least 1 month of public consultation on that. There's a hearing if applicable. Council will then consider those submissions, make a final proposal to the community and notify that. People who submit on the initial proposal have the opportunity to appeal or raise an objection, and in that case the Local Government Commission will make a determination. Those timeframes on the right-hand column are tentative only and no earlier than based on the timeframes that we're currently adhering to. Just finally in this section, I believe just finally, yes. We're a new team picking this up, seeing as this was previously run externally. We've gone through the previous workshops to try and get an understanding of what your views were previously. And just to allow you to understand what we've heard, and noting that some of this is potentially contested. So we've heard things such as that the Rangitata Huts community might be more closely aligned to Te Muka than Geraldine, and the opposite for Orari. We've heard some general discussion that retaining the wards and community boards ensures a sense of balance and doesn't allow Timaru Township to disproportionately dominate. And we've heard that there's a bit of an appetite to review the number of elected members in total, along with potentially looking at a peri or a community board. Now, to be clear, none of this is decided, set in stone. This is just what we've heard previously and what we're able to discuss today. What we understand we were asked to do, based on the previous workshop, was model a number of scenarios, including an urban v rural split, and consider a fourth ward, model amending the number of elected members, considering the addition of a community board, and check access to census data. So these are some of the tasks that we've gone away amongst others and that we aim to present to you today. That's the recap. Before we move to part 2 and considering communities of interest, I'll just pause to see if there are any questions or comments. Clear as mud? Perfect. Thank you. Please interrupt me at any point if there are any questions or comments. For this next part, we're sort of going to go shortly offline and do a slight little exercise, and then we'll dive into looking at different boundary options. So part 2, communities of interest. As I mentioned, the communities of interest are effectively the starting point for a representation review. They are the building blocks upon which the representation review is based. And the Local Government Commission provides 3 characteristics of a community of interest. Some of this has previously been mentioned in previous workshops, but some of them haven't, so please bear with me whilst I go through this. The 3 characteristics are firstly perceptual, secondly functional, and thirdly political. And you've got the ability to read their guidance there in terms of what that means. The key thing to note, or 2 key things to note, is firstly they change over time or may change over time. So it is necessary to review and reflect on them whilst doing a representation review. It cannot necessarily be assumed that they are the same. Secondly, to note, and I don't expect you to read all of this, but just to note this from the Local Government Commission, because this appears in almost all of their determinations, noting that the 3 characteristics are interdependent, they do relate to each other, and it's important that elected members go beyond what may intuitively feel is a community of interest, that they tease it out, that they understand what the differences are between distinct communities of interest rather than just necessarily commonalities, if that makes sense. So taking the step to being able to say, this is one distinct community of interest for XYZ reason, and here is another community of interest, and they are different because. That makes sense. I can discuss that further if you want, but I don't think it's possibly necessary. It will make more sense, perhaps, when we do the next exercise, which is, what I'm hoping to do, is give you an opportunity, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, to talk amongst yourselves in groups of 2 or 3, to go through some of these questions that the Local Government Commission has set, and this hasn't been done previously, as I understand it in previous workshops, to allow you to reflect on whether or not the existing communities of interest, being the 3 wards that have been broadly identified, are currently still fit for purpose. Is there something that's missing? Has something changed? Or do you believe that the current fit is correct? There may be animated discussion, there may be crickets, I'm not sure, but we think it's important that you have the opportunity at least to reflect on some of these questions. And I'm appreciative that we've got some group managers here who may, if necessary, be able to provide some supporting information. For example, Paul might be able to speak to population growth and subdivision, or Andrew, if he's here, speak to transport or the like. But what I'll do at this moment, if that's okay, is I'll just pause. I'll give you an opportunity to talk amongst yourselves in groups of 2, 3 through some of those questions, and then we can come back and discuss. Is that okay? Cool. Okay. Thank you.
I've always wanted to do that. Anyway, sorry.
Your drink bottle is useful for something.
Put some more water in, see if it changes.
Hopefully that discussion was useful and we didn't cut anyone off at the pass. At the risk of getting into the weeds, and there'll be an opportunity for free-range discussion later on, but is there anything anyone wants to comment on or question at this stage before we get into the boundary options?
I was just going to say the observation we made is that population growth across the whole district, based on those census figures, is 5% for Timaru, 6 for Temuka Point and 6 for Geraldine. So there's, yeah, assuming that's pretty consistent, you kind of wonder why there's a need to change. It's a workshop, there's no standing orders.
Any other questions, observations at this point? Very true. Okay, no worries. Like I said, there'll be an opportunity for free-range discussion later on. What I want to do now is look at some boundary options that we were asked to go away and reflect on, and discuss some of the pros and cons of each. To start with, the 2018 situation, as per the last representation review, if this clicker will work nicely, basically meant that we ended up with 3 wards, and all of them were had populations where the number of elected members relative to the number of voters meant that they were within the plus or minus 10% as required by legislation, at least in the first instance, and noting that these numbers don't include the mayor. Moving on, the latest data from Stats NZ shows that due to growth in certain areas or decline in others, and how that aligns to existing boundaries, ward boundaries, Geraldine is now underrepresented slightly relative to the others. Timaru still basically bang on, and Pleasant Point, Temuka heading to be slightly overrepresented. What that then means is we have a few decisions to be made. So let's look through a few options. Option number 1, for instance, and Malcolm Alexander did allude to this in some respects, and I'd like to go through it in a little bit more detail with you. Option 1, which you could look to do, would be to retain the current boundaries if you thought that they accurately reflected your communities of interest. You could then do one of two things. You could choose to amend the number of elected members that you have representing those wards so that the overall calculation, the plus or minus 10% for each of the 3, is within that threshold. And what that might look like, for example, if the clicker will work again, for Geraldine, the current number of elected members is 1. If you were to change that to 2, have another elected member for Pleasant Point, Temuka, have another 4 for Timaru, and have 15 in total, then what that would then mean would be that your overall 3 are within the plus or minus 10%. Now, to be very clear, that's a drastic and significant increase from in terms of the number of elected members, and that requires careful consideration. But that's just an illustration of how you could keep the existing boundaries but meet the plus or minus 10%. And one of the exercises that we're going to do later on is, through that link that we've sent you, allow you to play around with these numbers so that you can see what amending the number of elected members per any particular ward would do, because it can get quite messy quite quickly. The other thing that you could do, if you thought that your current boundaries were accurate and reflected your communities of interest accurately, is you could say, we're happy with the status quo, and self-report yourself to the Local Government Commission for a determination. As the maps show, on page 2, there's a table that we've provided, and that just shows some of the recent local government determinations relating to the plus or minus 10%. And you can see, they're based on council's final proposals, and you can see that in the past approximately 5 years, there have been around 21 that have gone to the Local Government Commission, and for a number of valid reasons, they were successful in 18 of those. Now, to be very clear, we provide this information to give you context. We're not trying to steer you in any particular direction. And your first objective as a council must be to attempt to comply with the legislation with the plus or minus 10%.
Excuse me, Brendan, do we know how many got declined? Because I got the impression from the last workshop that we had no hope, sorry to stop there, of getting that accepted. So of the 18 that it got accepted, was that 18 out of 18 or?
So what I did was go through the Local Government Commission website. There are probably about 40 determinations there, of which half might have applied to plus or minus 10%. The other half might have applied to, some other factor, number of elected members, for instance, or the like. Of the 21 applications within that period where there was a ward or wards outside the plus or minus 10%, 18 of those were successful, and there are some reasons why. On the next slide, I believe, if this works.
So 3 were declined, were they?
Three, yeah. Yeah, correct, yeah. And they were declined or partially declined for a number of reasons. For example, Hauraki in particular, the bottom one for being partially declined, was of particular interest to me. So in their example, they had 5 wards, one of which was slightly outside the plus or minus 10%, and they self-reported themselves to the Local Government Commission. The Local Government Commission said, we like your boundaries, we think you've correctly identified your communities of interest. However, adding or changing that particular non-compliant ward from 2 to 3 members and the cascading effect of that on the other 4 wards meant that suddenly all 5 wards were within the plus or minus 10%. So they said, yes, there are valid reasons why wards might be not compliant with the plus or minus 10%, but if there's they call it statistical entitlement to an additional representative, and that's not necessarily a drastic change, and I would suggest that what we've got there in terms of the change from 9 to 15 elected members to make it work is more significant than the Hauraki example, then that statistical entitlement doesn't override that non-compliance, if that makes sense. If the clicker will work, I just want to go through this. So that there is the map of the current boundaries, to be clear, and you've got that. So the legislation provides 3 reasons why, or 3 grounds for potentially being outside the plus or minus 10%. I won't go through all of them, but they're in detail, but they're outlined on that table in terms of it might be that there's an island or isolated community. Think, for example, Stewart Island, Banks Peninsula, or it might be that drawing the boundary in a particular way will either divide a community of interest arbitrarily or unite communities of interest that have few other commonalities. So in that sense, it's an artificial boundary which is designed only to comply with the legislation rather than provide effective representation to their community. Does that answer your question? I hope so. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions at this point? Okay, please let me know if there are.
Sorry, just an observation, Brendan. That's why the exercise we did earlier was quite critical in terms of representing to the Local Government Commission to support any boundary change or the maintenance of that status quo. So it's actually going through and understanding and recognising that we actually do understand those communities of interest really well.
Just before I move on to option 2, the key point of option 1 here is to let you know that you have an option if you think you've identified your communities of interest accurately and the current boundaries accurate. You have the option to apply to be outside the plus or minus 10%. We can't advise what the Local Government Commission, how they might view that. but you know that there's an option and that there's some precedent for that. Right, moving on then to option number 2, specifically 2A and 2B. Now this draws off some of the work that was done in the previous workshop and since. There was, as we understand it, some guidance from the last workshop that elected members wanted to see some more work around moving the boundary around Orari. So what we've done, Mark, Tash and myself, is take what was the old option 1 and the old option 3 and work on them a little bit more and update them with the numbers and the like. To be clear, we didn't include what was the old option 2 because there appeared to be a lack of appetite to split the Orari community arbitrarily, and indeed, if that is the case, that's reinforced from other local government commission determinations. So in that sense, the old option 1, which is now 2A, to move the entire community from one ward to another, or option 3, split them following Stat Hoi 1 as close as possible within the constraints of the mesh blocks, generates the following result. Bear in mind, these were designed by Malcolm and Tash to be compliant with the plus or minus 10% rule, and that was based on the 2022 estimates. It's still the case with the 2023 estimates. Bear in mind, these numbers don't include the mayor or any at-large members, which you currently don't have, but you can choose to have. So, what I'll do at this point is just pause to see if there's any comment or discussion or guidance around whether or not you like the idea of moving Orari from one ward to another in part or in full, bearing in mind that this discussion should be, or your comments or observations should be informed by the community of interest exercise that you've undertaken.
Did you consider going down in numbers? Did you consider going down? You've gone up. Did you look at going the other way?
Do you mean in terms of elected members? So those elected members that are there in 2A and 2B are the current numbers of elected members, and it's illustrative only. What we'll do a little bit later on in the workshop is give you these models, these spreadsheets, so that you can, we can do it collectively, dynamically. We can play around with different numbers of elected members so that you can see what making a change here or there might do. We did consider providing that modelling to you at the outset. However, because there are so many different options within, in terms of how to tweak the number of elected members, within each of these options, and we're presenting 5 to you today, we'd be presenting effectively 30 or 35 different options to you, and we thought that was probably not very helpful. So we're aiming to do that a little bit more at the end. So firstly, reflecting on the communities of interest. Secondly, seeing how our boundaries align with that, regardless of what it does to the plus or minus 10%. And then thirdly, doing what you've asked in terms of having a look at the number of elected members to see how that factors into the overall situation. So yes, we've looked at how changing the number of elected members might impact it, and the numbers that you're seeing here are just an example.
Have you got some information around comparisons between different areas and the numbers each councillor is representing?
We do have that. I don't have it off the top of my computer for you today, but we have looked at that, and I could find that for you. For instance, we're going to have a break whilst you play around with the spreadsheets, the models for the number of elected members. I can find that information for you whilst we do that. And I could bring that back to you a little bit later in the workshop in about 50 minutes or so.
I was just reading the Christchurch stuff. There are like 17 councillors, probably 500,000 people.
Yep.
So,
and Auckland is 20 for 1.5 million.
yeah.
Yep.
So, those numbers are considerably different to what we're talking about here.
Yep. Absolutely, quite correct observation. The key thing to reflect on there, I suppose, is number one, what is required to give fair and effective representation to any particular community. So, for example, larger communities as opposed to larger districts, TAs, as opposed to smaller ones, might require more in order for effective representation. Auckland, for example, Christchurch, they have very significant community or local boards that they empower to do quite a lot of work for the main council, so that's all part of the mix as well. Yeah, that's why reflecting on community boards is part of this representation review exercise. Any comments on that? No? Okay. And so like I say, just wondering if at this point there are any questions, observations around moving Orari or any other part of the district from one ward to another to attempt to get within the plus or minus 10%.
We
Yeah,
were
I guess-
probably 2 or 3 to 1. That Orari belonged probably more with Geraldine than Te Moka. We were probably 2 or 3 to 1, that Orari probably belonged more with Geraldine than Te Moka, as we felt they would probably be more connected with that. Scotty chose to disagree, but
Surely he's just growing the Te Moka empire.
yeah.
And I hope the camera recorded that. And just for the record, what factors made you think that Orari might be more closely linked with Geraldine? Was it transport? Was it schooling? Something else?
Probably schooling, I think, yeah. And just being that, I'm only kind of guessing here, but being that little bit further away from Te Moka, you'd probably gravitate to Geraldine for the supermarket, doctors and things like that, I think, yeah.
Any other view? Yep.
Yeah, I guess considering the electorate, how they move the electorate lines around, and you know, Geraldine now is part of the Waitaki, it used to be, and they just basically cut and dice as they see is necessary to balance those numbers. And to be fair, as long as they've got someone that's representing them, that's the most important thing. So, I mean, your option 2A makes quite a bit of sense to me, and I can't see why the people at Orari are still going to get representation. That just means that there's someone else, and they just talk to someone else when they pick the phone up. So I guess that's my
You can
opinion.
leave that on. I think if you're going to take Orari into Te Moka, you take the whole of Orari and not split the community. I don't think that would be helpful for the community.
Yeah, I'd agree with Councillor Parker on that one. I think you can't split up Orari, surely. One side of the road for one side for the other. No, it has to be all-encompassing, I think.
Any other questions, comments, disagreements?
Don't worry, I'm not going to disagree with you. I think at the end of the day, like, as we did discuss, if you were to get our community members and hand them this blank map and draw where they thought the boundaries were, I would challenge that even one could do it. At the end of the day, Alan Booth is correct. You know, the people just want represented. Don't put that on a T-shirt. Yeah. Goodness me. Well, too late to walk it back, am I? At the end of the day, it's about representation, isn't it? And I think that your community, so long as they're satisfied that they have representation and quality representation, the boundaries don't matter. Because the boundaries at the end of the day, even though they're a line on a map, they are blurred. They are quite blurred, you know.
We talk about that too, and where there's communities like Rangitata Huts, for instance, it's something that the councillors from both Te Moka Point Ward and Geraldine Ward would go down and meet with those communities. So you kind of, there's crossover points anyway.
Yeah, my feeling there is that Orari people probably do align more with Geraldine folk in all kinds of ways. It's just their utilisation of things, the facilities in our place and schooling and so on. The Kākahu area we haven't talked about much, but I think those bods very much align with Geraldine. So that's the other dark blue patch there, more out to the west.
Any comments on that?
The reality is, you go into either of those blue blocks and I can find you people that align. You know, it's easy enough to say these people in this area align themselves with this place and think that encompasses everybody, but it doesn't, and it doesn't in any of these cases.
And two observations before we move on. The first is the Local Government Commission acknowledges that the further you get from a main centre, the more one's identity or sense of distinction blurs. Perfectly fine and valid. And the second thing is the process is designed to have the opportunity for change and feedback baked into it. So, for example, whatever council chooses at a later date to make as an initial proposal, there'll be community consultation based on that, and that may reinforce what your thinking is, or it may challenge that, but it can all be factored into the process. Okay. It sounds like we're quite comfortable to move on. What I'd like to do at this point is hand over to Mark to explain the next bit. All right, we've sort of moved on beyond that anyway, really.
Well, we sort of moved on beyond that, but this is, we had over the course of the past couple of weeks, as we've worked through this process, debated a number of principles, I guess, and one was how a township would feel if it was in fact divided and divided by lines. And flippantly, we thought that there could be two potential options. One was to approach NZTA and see if they'd move the highway through Orari. High degree of success we factored was probably going to come from that. The other was to approach Land Information New Zealand and see if they would move the mesh blocks to satisfy us. We figured that that was probably not going to, so we scarpered that. That actually isn't a nuclear bomb on Orari itself to deal with an issue. It's just dealing with that part of our option analysis.
Thank you, Mark. Moving on. Okay.
My work here is done.
So one of the other options or bits of feedback that we picked up from one of the previous workshops was what might adding a fourth ward look like? And again, that comes back to, do we have the communities of interest correct? Is there a fourth distinct community of interest relative to the current three that needs to be represented? So just as an illustrative example of this, to start the discussion, the simplest thing that we could do as a team was to split Pleasant Point Temuka, the current ward, into two, based on their community board boundaries, and see what that would do in terms of the threshold. So you can see on the right-hand side there that Geraldine would still be overrepresented, Pleasant Point significantly underrepresented, Temuka underrepresented, and Timaru still bang on correct. What this, as I say, simply means is, to give you an illustration of what adding that fourth ward might look like, the question that you need to ask yourselves is there a desire for a fourth ward? Is there a fourth community of interest that needs to be represented? So I'll pause at that point to see if there's any comments or discussion.
Was it once like that? Like, was this Pleasant Point its own and Temuka? What's the history there? Or
I couldn't give you the exact history, but I know that back in the 70s and 80s, before the local government reforms, that there were various different councils, like a Geraldine Council, a Strathallan Council, etc. I believe that since the 1990s or so, we've had a three-ward system in Timaru district, that is.
Is there another option of just having Timaru and one other ward, as in Geraldine, Temuka, Pleasant Point, all as one?
There certainly is that option if the council believes that that reflects the communities of interest appropriately, i.e. someone who lives within Timaru Township is significantly distinct and requires different representation from someone who lives in those other townships. versus, say, people who live rurally, that's absolutely something that we could model up. But it goes back to your reflection and consideration of what your communities of interest are and how they should be represented. I'm not hearing any overwhelming desire for a fourth ward.
I think it'd be interesting to know what the Pleasant Point community think, given they have two Temuka-based councillors this time around.
And also,
Anna's not here anymore, is she?
no,
Yeah.
no, she's not. And also, I have always found it intriguing that West Timaru was part of the Pleasant Point Temuka ward, and having a lot to do with Pleasant Point community of late, and also having family connections out there, and it possibly goes back to when they closed the high school there, that a lot of Pleasant Point people align themselves more with Timaru, whether they live in the country, work in town, or send their kids into high schools in Timaru, and they do that before they'll do that to Geraldine or Temuka. So the Pleasant Point around the back of Timaru as a ward, it does actually make sense to me, to be fair.
It's not my area, so take this with a grain of salt and all, but I feel as though it's an easier shift to make, and most particularly, it's not going to affect anybody in terms of their schooling or where they shop at the supermarket. But remember, we've just done some quite big strategic planning framework exercises. It seems to me, to actually take people out when they've contributed significantly to that strategic framework and chuck them into a completely different one, they've had no hand in. That's quite a hard ask, but to create something new is a far easier segue, I believe.
I'm not sure I agree, Jean, because as we discussed before, the community boards did those strategic plans. The wards here are not the same conversation as the community boards. So those community boards and those community board wards would still elect their community board and would still have input into that, wouldn't they?
Not to say it was ever going to be an easy thing, but easier. Yeah.
I believe it's quite an interesting concept that our Chief Executive has just mentioned. Taking all those, it'd be interesting to do the numbers around just Timaru City and everything else, what that comes up at.
5 to 4, and there's about a 7 to 5% difference, so they're within the 10%. Because I kind of think the previous conversation about urban and rural, that's what I had in my mind, as opposed to what's been modelled here, which is all the little urban centres. I kind of think, and Jan's talked about it a lot, how people in those wards like Geraldine, for example, only get to vote for one councillor. This way they could potentially vote for 4. And I think it's an option really worth looking at.
It's certainly something we can model up. Sorry? We can check that, that's fine. And we can, the beauty of the exercise we're going to do shortly is that we can play around with those numbers so that, it's fully transparent, you can see what's going on. And we can certainly model that up for you. Okay, moving on then, if that's okay. Moving to that fourth option, we were asked to have a look at what an urban-rural split might be, and to be clear, what we're about to describe to you is illustrative only. If you wanted to pursue it further, we would need some additional guidance, and I'll get Tash to talk through that in a moment. But effectively, we had to make a significant number of assumptions about what urban or rural might mean and how to draw those boundaries based on the mesh box, because it is certainly not necessarily a tidy exercise. Tash, do you want to explain further about some of those considerations?
Yeah. Oh, here we go. Thanks, Brennan. Sorry about that, guys. Wee bit of an IT glitch. As Brennan was saying, with the urban and rural, it wasn't just as simple as dividing, from the town. In this particular case on the maps, I've gone through township outlines. as far as our rural. But then if you're also looking at the rural lines too, are you looking at like our small sediments, such as Pearl Forest, Blandswood, Rangitata, that sort of stuff, where you've got the little sediments as well. So do we divide them up was another consideration. Because of the data around appears to be, and our numbers, especially with the census data just for these, is around the mesh blocks, it's kind of, the town outlines are sort of split in between. So for example, we look at Timaru on my GUIS data. I'll just get rid of the highway. You'll see that the mesh blocks which I've divided and the aqua is roughly, Brendan and I had a bit of fun last Friday just to see what it would look like. So we had to make some assumptions with the mesh block. So you could see and this is the other thing too, with our assumptions, this is just keeping in mind what we're thinking around the town outline. So this mesh block here, if I go select, and I'll just select that one for you. That mesh block, when it decides to come up, that one in its own right itself, as you can see, part of Timaru from Gleneagles and the golf course and that comes into it, but then on the other side, as far as here, that's classified as rural, especially, and then I was kind of playing around with the numbers as far as our operative and our proposed district plans. How we've got stuff for our township, central CBD, and then we've also got what's going to be rural lifestyle opposed to rural. And then also what is our urban area, and then we've also got the future development area, which is on the upper part of this mesh block here, which is, you've got that particular area here, which is now becoming a future development area. So it's kind of like, are we doing it as of now, or are we looking at, how are we going to divide it as far as what to make urban and what to make rural? And every time the mesh block, even if I chucked on, for example, just for a show and tell, if I chucked in the proposed district plan layers, as you can see the different colours that are divided around there, with our town, and if I turn off that one there, and I'll just chuck on our 2023 blocks, and I'll put them on top, you can see the yellow outlines of our mesh blocks around. It's probably not that clear on there, but as you can see, this part here is rural, and then you've got your rural lifestyle there, but then you've got urban all around here. So, and the mesh blocks are sort of divided into the larger areas. So it was just trying to play around with that numbers. What do we consider as urban and rural?
Not sure they were a good choice of words in hindsight. I kind of almost feel like it's in a Timaru, out of Timaru, or, it's not necessarily rural, urban, it's, town and country, call it whatever you want.
Yeah, that's why I decided to do, or Brendan and I as a team, and Mark decided to do as an outline as far as just our town outlines. I also had a bit of a play with that because of our towns and our urbans, was also more thinking of our rate boundary roles. Rate roll boundaries, how we classify when we actually do our rates, how we charge our township people, as far as that goes as far as getting the mesh blocks in for.
Do the mesh blocks follow the river, the Opahi River? Do they all bound, or do they cross the river?
They cross.
That's silly.
They cross. So, for example, you've got one right.
Because rivers are always a beautiful marker, aren't they?
Yeah.
Because, you think about people in Cave, they go on the highway up Pleasant Point straight to Timaru. People in Pleasant Point go up the highway straight to Timaru. Whereas the people in Temuka, they stay on that side of the river. And so do the Geraldine people. Strangely enough, that's what they do. That's why we've got Waitaki and Timaru. That's why people never cross the bridge. Goes right back, to 1800s. It was too difficult.
Could I just add that I think the minister, the rural minister, is trying to define rural right now. Yeah, good luck. Yeah. From a Geraldine perspective, I'd say it's probably important to recognise that it's not just a matter of geography and land area that you live on. There's a lot of cultural stuff in the mix of being rural. So when I take Geraldine, I think about all the agri-sector people living there and retired farmers and so on. And I think they consider themselves rural.
Sorry, is it fair to say that the rural-urban question isn't rural-urban, it's more Timaru Township and the rest? In terms of the...
100%, I don't think this option in front of us is a valid option at all. Yeah, and it's definitely done that, yeah, yeah.
That's why I also calculated on the map that you guys have in front of you. That's also why I put in the totals for, because I thought that you might have wanted to see them for. So within those mesh blocks that I've done around the town outlines, which was hopefully answering your question before, I've got the numbers for as far as approximate numbers from the 2023 for each of those outline townships from where the mesh blocks, and then just taken those mesh blocks around it for those townships. And then you've also got on the top the number for what everything else would be, apart from our townships numbers. That's why I called it rural. So hopefully that answers that question. I'm sorry.
What I'll do is just move on to the next couple of slides so you can just see what...
Just before you do that, the Pariora Cave, Pleasant Point, that ring, when you start adding those numbers up, they're getting up towards 2,000 something. And actually, strangely enough, that road up through to Cave from Pariora, whatever the road's called, and then back through to Pleasant Point, there is sort of some synergy there, isn't it? No? All right.
Again, too, just be advised too that with your mesh blocks, the bigger the mesh block, there may be no one in there. So that's the other thing with the mesh blocks is that with the distance and stuff. So even if you've got that 500 in Pariora, the next mesh blocks that go on that road, there may be no numbers, so it may still be the 500 or 600. When you bring in Timaru into it, yeah, by all means, the further away you go up. Yep, the mesh blocks goes by as actually, all these mesh blocks are actually within our district. Yep, so with our district outline.
I kind of see maybe where you're going through, Nigel, because if you look at Pariora and they don't have stormwater pipes down there, it's just like holes in the footpath. Septic tanks would be maybe similar to what someone in Cave or out the back of Pleasant Point is dealing with as well. So that they're dealing with the same kind of infrastructure service, they've got the same level of service maybe, which is not necessarily what Timaru people have got the level of service for. Yeah.
Since you talked about the OP River and what you're saying, Sally, is I'd be keen at looking at the numbers, like a southern ward being one side of the OP and a northern ward being the other side of the OP, and seeing what those numbers look like. Because I agree there's probably more synergies between Point and Pariora to the Timaru than what, some of those Cave and out the back of Timaru have to the Temuka Pleasant Point ward at the moment. Yeah.
We can definitely have a play around with the numbers around the rivers and that for the next. I'm more than happy to go on the research for that, yeah. Yeah.
It's interesting. I think we overthink this because you can put a boundary around everything, and you can argue that Geraldine and Temuka only get to vote or not vote, depends whether there was election or not for one councillor and a mayor. but then, you know, they also get to vote for community boards and you don't in town. And actually, if we, you know, went on the community boards versus council and committee meetings, actually you'd say the active democracy sits within the community boards because they were chocolate with public forum and other things. So it's less about boundary for me and more about, and I know we've got to go through this process, but it's actually, you know, it's the conversation that we had this morning around actually attending, you know, Timaru councillors attending those community board members. That's how we take democracy to the people as opposed to the other way around. So I think we can put whatever line on the map, but actually once you're elected, it's about us representing the people in whatever shape or form that looks like. So let's not, yeah. I know that we can kick this around forever and a day, but it's just a line on the map and they're all within the Timaru district. You do, then you lose rural community representation totally. But that's the problem, isn't it? If you go to the rural, and that's fine, and they could be elected from anywhere, and then you know you could not have a Geraldine councillor. You know, you could have them all sitting in Temuka. So that's the risk that you get by going at large with such an area. So you can be taking representation away in it. Yeah, so it's a fine balance.
And that's why the identification of the communities of interest are important, so that you know what areas or types of people within your community you're ensuring you represent or need to be represented versus ones that may not need to be.
And I'd just say, if that concept were to be progressed, I think it'd be very good to keep it hand in hand with the conversation about community boards.
And we will have that discussion shortly. I'll just quickly zip through these next couple of slides. So fully noting the conversation around urban-rural wards, and I think you've heard clearly we've had to make a number of assumptions to try and mock this up for you. If we were to go along with the assumptions that we've designed, then, for instance, you could achieve a compliance within the plus or minus 10% by having 8 elected members from those urban areas versus 2 from the rural ward. Before we move on to the number of elected members exercise, I just want to pause, because in the previous workshop we heard some discussion around establishment of potentially a Pariora community board, which is possible, or more broadly there might be discussion around the existing community boards. But there's also the opportunity to have at-large members, and this can be in conjunction with wards. Or we might discuss anything else that's within the remit of the representation review. So I just want to pause at this point to see if there's any further discussions around any of that before we look at numbers of elected members.
I must have missed that, the Pariora Community Board. That's the first I've heard of that, so I must have been asleep at the wheel or something. But I just wonder for 500 people. Interesting.
I might be able to help you there. I think the question was thrown out there, should they have a community board? How is council engaging with that community? Is there another way other than a community board? And I think the Mayor referenced an existing working group or something like that that was working with them. So just simply raising that again so that we can make sure that we're clear on what the guidance may or may not be that you'd like us to model.
Yeah, look, and actually getting representatives even for that group has been a challenge in its own right, just because of population. Yeah, so it's, it's something we'll continue to work at, but yeah.
Any thoughts on any other community boards or at-large members?
I'd just like at-large to be, talked about properly. Last time it wasn't much on the table at all. And of course there are issues there for us in Geraldine. When it comes to the councillor level, we get to vote on, we've got a say in one person who's making decisions on our behalf. So it needs to be out there on the table.
one thing I can certainly say to that is that it will be, regardless of what council resolves to do in terms of initial proposal and for community consultation, it will be highlighted as an option through the community consultations so that we can receive feedback.
I'm not sure how the argument holds though. The problem is that, you know, in a general election, we got to vote for, you know, one individual and a party, slightly different. But, you know, we've only got one individual representing us out of 120 members, ultimately. I just think, I personally think that, no offence, but it's a narrow view when you're just thinking that one person around the council table is representing your community of, yeah. Yeah, and that's the thing, and no, totally.
My point is that it gets discussed. I'm not necessarily an advocate for at large. I'm an advocate for it being discussed around the district.
I think more the point Jan is making is that Councillor Jackson gets to vote for 6 people around this table. And I only get to vote for none, actually, because it wasn't an election, but yeah, you get the point. You know, whereas, you know, Jan can only vote for one person who sits around this table. And it's not about once we're here who we represent, it's more you're only having a say. Whereas your point about a general election, that's the same up and down the country. Yeah.
Yeah. No. And I mean, going back, the at-large conversation nearly destroyed the council back in whenever it was. It was before you, Sally, I think, wasn't it, when they had that, it was the Team Timaru years, and they, you know, nearly had it over the line. And I think if that got over the line, then you'd have probably 10 representatives from Timaru looking after the whole district, and that's the challenge with that conversation.
I think the conversation, though, is more that understanding that by having an award system, that is what you forfeit, and that is the price to pay of an award system, and you might be absolutely 100% happy with that price, but that is the price you're paying, yeah.
I think, sorry, to finish before you jump in, Councillor Booth, I think what people forget is actually the representation is straight away when Geraldine's got a vote, and not always, but I would say 9 times out of 10, the communities pretty much get what is recommended through from the community board level. Straight away, you've got the rural councillors and normally the mayor on your side, so you get up to a 4 to 6 as far as our democracy goes. So you only need 1 and a bit, and you're there. So I just argue that the representation is actually there, and the model. If you stepped away from the model, then that's when you probably put and you go at large, that's when you risk the community boards.
I guess I was just going to mention that it's really up to the wards to put strong people forward who are going to represent you. And so a good competition out in your rural area and identifying the people who are going to come in and participate and contribute is probably the most important thing that can happen. So ultimately that's up to the local community.
Haven't we currently got a halfway house? Because effectively Timaru is at large, and then you've got some rural wards, and I always thought of wards all being sort of equal size. So if you've got 48,000 people, you might have 10 wards of 4,800 or whatever the number works out to be. But we don't do that. We sort of have this mixed. We're really mixed.
We did have, not talking about you, Councillor Scott, but we did have people from outside of the Timaru ward standing in like we had somebody from Temuka standing in the Timaru ward, so that was kind of effectively at large, yeah.
I got voted in, thank you very much. To hear all my life, thank you very much.
She did originate from the Glenetti ward.
Well, it sounds like we may be able to move on.
I I think we need to.
I think what's been highlighted is, number one, there are trade-offs no matter what system you go for. And secondly, the legislation requires, number one, that there's a plus or minus 10% threshold, which means that populations need to be broadly represented equally. Whereas under a different legislative model, take America for instance, each of the 50 states gets 2 senators. So someone in Wyoming has, from a senator perspective, the exact same weight, far more weight than, say, someone from California. They've got a completely different philosophy around it and legislative framework. Ours is different, and we work within the model that we have.
God bless America.
Someone probably needs to.
Someone needs to.
This workshop has deviated. Right, what I'd like to do now, and I'm conscious of time, there's around 15 minutes or so left within our allotted slot, which is probably pretty good. What I'd like to do is ask you to take the opportunity to pop to the email link that I sent you yesterday and go to your designed or designated spreadsheet. You've each got a separate one so that you can't overlay each other's work. What this is designed to do, and we'll do it for 5 minutes or so, maybe 10, is we've looked at communities of interest, which is the first building block. We've then looked at how you effectively represent those communities of interest, and yes, there's discussion around what the communities of interest are, but that's fine. So how do you effectively represent them? Now we then move to the third stage, which is how do you fairly represent them, where, relatively speaking, votes are cast of equal weight if there's indeed a ward system. So I'm not sure we can bring it up on the screen unless, Tash, you're able to go to the link. Apologies to anyone watching online that they don't have access to this. So hopefully what this will do, if you go through the various of the 4 or 5 options that we've modelled for you, is you can plug in a couple of numbers. You could, for instance, say, I quite like option 2A, for instance, regarding Orari, but I feel that we need a different number of elected members to accurately and effectively represent that community. Maybe just pop into Councillor Piddington, seeing as he's an apology. Councillors Burt and Oliver might be using theirs remotely. Yeah, pop into that one, why not? To be clear, I don't expect us to do this as a group on the screen via Tash, etc. What I want to do is pause for a few minutes, go offline, give you an opportunity to play around with these numbers. Please only play around with the column for elected members. If you play around with some of the other ones, the formulas, then it will distort the results. But we'll just pause for 5 minutes or so, let you do that. I'll come around and then we'll bring it back together. Is that okay? Cool. Again, I feel like the teacher. Good career change, Alan. I think they are currently down on staff, so. Anyway. Well, I see Peter Burt made a comment online saying Alan Booth is always correct, so Alan's having a really, really good day. If I may, I'll bring it back together. I'm just conscious of time. We might go a couple minutes over, but there is another presentation after this. Hopefully everyone's had an opportunity to have a little bit of a play around. If you haven't, because the technology didn't work or the like, please feel free to come see me after this or the like, and we can have a discussion about that. That exercise was just designed to help you understand some of the behind-the-scenes mechanics, how it can be quite finely balanced to try and get wards within the plus or minus 10% and the like. What I'll do at this point is just move to the final slide, if the clicker will work. Perfect. And this is all about bringing everything together, providing us with some clear guidance so that as your officers we can move forward and come back to you with what you're looking for. I know that Councillor Burt's provided a couple of comments online. I don't know if Councillor Oliver's also online, so I'll just pause and see if they're able to turn their audio on if they want to make any comments. He didn't want to? Okay. Jess, correct me if I'm wrong, but his comments effectively were that he liked the status quo but wanted proportional representation, something like that. Okay. Okay. So, just before I wrap it up and I tell you at least what I've heard and then you can correct me, just to Councillor Booth's point before, he was asking earlier in the session about number of elected members per population. So we've got the data from Stats NZ, I can distribute it, but just as a rough idea throughout Canterbury, for example. So Timaru, currently, under the 2023 population estimates and current number of elected members, we've got 5,441 people per elected member. Take, for instance, Ashburton, 4,080, so about 1,500 less. Queenstown, oh, that's outside of Canterbury, to be fair, but that's 4,800. Huranui, 1,380. Christchurch, just below 2,500. Selwyn, just over 8,000. Mackenzie, 813. Waitaki, 2,500. Waimate, just over 1,000. As a general rule, if you were to do it on an XY axis, it would be the more urban you are, the higher number of people are represented by an elected member. The more rural you are, the fewer, and Timaru may be somewhere in the middle, for example. So just to give you an idea of comparisons. But if you're interested, we can share that spreadsheet. They've got them for the entire country. Yeah. And ultimately, it's up to you, the councillors as a body, as to whether or not you feel that we have the right representation, the right number of elected members. Are there any comments anyone wants to make about the number of elected members before we talk about boundaries?
So with those comments, were you suggesting that we should get a larger district and perhaps some extra community boards in Waimate and Fairly Twizel? Is that where you're leading us?
Mark is right, we can't make a decision. You, your worship, are our community leader, so if you'd like to announce an invasion of someone, then it would be through you, not through us as officers.
But I think yes.
Okay. So bringing everything together, what I've heard today, if I may be so bold as to say so, is in terms of guidance, it sounds like council is comfortable with the wards as opposed to, say, an at-large system in terms of a proposal. It sounds like you're comfortable with the existing community boards and their boundaries. Would that be fair to say? Please tell me if I'm wrong, but I'm just telling you what I've heard so that we can go away and model this up for you in a report so you can make some decisions. It sounds as if there's a desire to look at a few options in terms of boundaries, one of which is the status quo with outside the plus or minus 10% as one option. Another one would be possibly that 2A, where all of Orari is moved from one ward to another, so that we're within the plus or minus 10%. Might be another option. There was another one that Councillor Pai referred to, maybe it was the Mayor, Chief Executive, sorry, I lost track of that exactly, but it was a north of the Opahi versus a south of the Opahi, looking at what that might look like from a numbers perspective. And then fourthly, there was a Timaru Township versus the rest, or as one ward, and then the rest is another ward. Have I understood that correctly? Please correct me if I've got anything incorrect.
Can you just tell me when we go out for consultation what that looks like? Do we go, this is what we're proposing, tell us what you think? Or do we go, here's 4 options, tell us what you think? Or 2 options or something?
Good question. So we are required, council is required to resolve an initial proposal with one draft option. As part of that, we can take the community through what other valid options are, including the ones that we've looked at. So it's certainly not a case of saying, here is our one option, what do you think, in isolation. We can take the community with us, but we are required to resolve an initial proposal on one option. So if, for example, those 4 options that I've just outlined reflect the broad thinking of the council in terms of what you'd like to consider in a council paper, we can go away, do that work, present a paper, present a report at a council meeting, and you can resolve to go with an initial proposal of one of those 4 options, or something completely different. Or alternatively, if you don't feel like you're at that stage, then we can go away, do this work, come back for another workshop. We'll be guided by you.
Another question, if we wanted to stay status quo and apply for an exemption, does that happen before consultation or after? Or when?
Good question. So we would, if you wanted to go with the status quo with outside the plus or minus 10%, we'd go to the community with that as the initial proposal. The community would provide feedback. Council could choose to amend the proposal based on that. But anyway, resolve to make a final proposal, and if that final proposal is still outside the plus or minus 10%, or if there are any appeals to that, then it goes to the Local Government Commission. So there's certainly, it's not an immediate fast track to the Local Government Commission.
And if it gets declined, then we have to start all over again?
It wouldn't be, if the Local Government Commission doesn't agree with Council, they will make the determination for us. We will not go through the entire process again. And Council, regardless of whether we're outside the plus or minus 10%, if we do end up requiring a determination from the Local Government Commission, we're involved in that discussion. So, for example, the Mayor, Deputy Mayor, Council officers would be represented on that. So we're certainly able to present our case. And one of the things that they look for is, for example, how have you identified your communities of interest? The exact exercise that we've been doing today and that we've been doing in other workshops. So that's why these exercises are so important. Yeah. But no, we wouldn't have to do the whole exercise again.
Look, my only comment is the last option. I know it's worth a conversation, but I think it just opens a can of worms, and you'll end up losing representation because it's counter to the wards, I think, and you're going to end up with, you know, a Periora included with a Geraldine, and, you know, then the practicality of the democracy, how does that work with bringing it together? Where do they meet? Where do they, you know, it's bigger than just a light on a map. I just think it's on a hiding to nothing. Happy if there's enough nods around the table to take it through. Otherwise, personally, I would leave it off. Yeah.
Timaru versus everything else. What about the split along Opahi?
Yeah, I'm okay.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So getting some feedback from Pleasant Point around whether they would like to look at a 4th ward, is that what you're meaning? Yeah, so the numbers were significantly out for option 3, the 4 wards, on the current boundaries and the current numbers of elected members. We could do an exercise, for example, to see how many, on the current boundaries, how many elected members might be needed for any particular ward to get within the plus or minus 10% or a lot closer to it. Ultimately, today...
You've also got to make sure that
Is there a desire for us to go away and do some work around Pleasant Point? Is there a desire for us to go away and prepare some information to come back as a workshop, or do you feel like if we presented these options to you in a report that you would have enough information to make an informed decision?
I don't think you need to reinvent the wheel here, just make some minor adjustments.
So that's to clarify. So a report including the status quo with the outside plus or minus 10%, the 2A Orari option, north of Opahi versus south of Opahi, Timaru and the rest, and then looking at Pleasant Point. And okay,
We're eliminating Timaru and the rest.
Timaru and the rest eliminated? Okay, cool. Okay. Excellent. Thank you very much for your time. If you have any further questions or want to discuss any aspect of this, please do not hesitate to contact us. We're very happy to guide you through any aspect of it. Thank you for your time.
Yep, so he's just going to talk about the recovery plan for Canterbury and a bit of background on recovery, which is important. So I'm actually a recovery manager for Timaru District Council. I'm have done it in the past, and Paul is backup over there. And then we've got Darren, who is our civil defence response, so you probably all know. So I'll pass it over to Richard.
Kia ora koutou, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you today. And it's great to have your civil defence team here for when you've got the difficult questions, I'll be able to flick them to them to answer. Yes, so what I wanted to talk to you about today is recovery, which tends to be the bit of civil defence that tends to get overlooked. There's usually a big focus on response for good reason, but the recovery is a bit that, as I say, gets overlooked. And what I'm wanting to talk to you about today is we've produced a draft plan, or a first iteration of a plan, which is about recovery, particularly from a large event. I'm not particularly concerned about small events, but the recovery effort increases exponentially with the size of the event. So what usually happens is people think, yeah, we can cope. Oh my goodness, we can't. And so wanting to think ahead of what are we going to do when your district or any other district, possibly in a big event, the whole region, suddenly says, actually, this is bigger than us and we need help. So that's really what this is about today. I'm happy to take questions as I go through. I can talk through a bit of a presentation and so happy to take any questions as we go. That particular photo there is from Hawke's Bay last year. They had jet boats going over the top of their house. They didn't even know there was a house underneath there. And they'd just taken, when I visited them on this day, they'd just taken all their belongings out, putting it out on the road to be taken away on a skip. So key messages for me. First of all, recovery is not just about what the council does. So restoring your council services, that's the job of your chief executive and his team. But the CDM role in recovery, and this is where Andrew and Paul as your recovery managers fit in, it's about coordinating all the different agencies involved. So that they may be NGOs, such as your rural support trusts, working with farming groups. It may be government agencies like MSD, for example, with financial assistance, the whole range. And the CDM role is that coordination role. So everybody's joined up and looking and pointing in the same direction, which is different from restoring your own services. The second point, as I've got up there, is that it's long, it's complex, it usually costs a lot of money, and it involves an awful lot of people. Response tends to be short and sharp, and then the responders, in my experience, job done, and we'll pass this over to Muggins, who happens to be the recovery manager. And the third one is we're not prepared for recovery, and it was my recent experience in the Christchurch fires, where I was both controller and recovery manager because James Thompson was away on the Chatham Islands. He came back for a day and then he had COVID. So I managed to get both of them. And it really reinforced for me, actually, we haven't, despite my being in my role for 2 years and talking to people about it, we didn't have the staff and the structures and understanding needed to really swing into it. We got there, but actually from a recovery perspective, the fires was a really small event. Big in terms of response, but recovery, it's really small, and we still struggled. So what tends to happen is say out there, it's often building the plane while flying it, and that's just not good enough, because what we find is the wings fall off fairly quickly. So we need to prepare now. As I say, the time to repair the roof is when the sun's shining, not when it's raining, and that's what this is about. So today I just want to give a bit of a context of it, talk about some of the key components of the plan. I'm not sure whether you've been given a copy. It's there. It's not a huge document, and certainly if you haven't seen it, it's available for you to look at if you want. And then just discussion in terms of whatever you want to ask or talk about. So just in terms of that context, I spoke about the 4 R's of civil defence, the first one being reduction, the second one readiness, and then response and recovery. 95% of what we do is actually in readiness, so it's trying to make sure we've got the systems and processes in place so that we can respond and recover. And that's really where this plan fits in. It's about being ready for the 4th R. People usually also say recovery starts on day 1 of an event. So yes, it should start during response, because there's stuff that we can be doing in response that will help our recovery. Also, I think a lot of people would argue it actually starts in reduction in terms of reducing the risks in the first place as part of making sure we're ready for recovery. Just in terms of the definition and what we're talking about, so there's a definition on the Act, and you can read that for yourself, but I'll just try and pull out a few things from it. First of all, it's about that coordination, so it's a coordinated efforts and processes. It's about different timeframes, the immediate, medium term and long term. And, in Christchurch, there are aspects of us still recovering from the Christchurch earthquakes. So it can be very long term. And I was talking downstairs, and in response, typically, you're thinking, what are we going to do tomorrow? Or long term is, what are we going to do in a week's time? Recovery is actually what's going to come up in 3 months, 6 months, 2 years, or longer. And just continuing with that definition, it's about holistic, so it includes all the well-being. So it's economic, it's social, it's environmental, it's cultural, goes across all of them. And often economic is actually, which is not usually a big part of your response. Response is about protecting people and property, and usually, the private sector will look after themselves. In recovery, a strong economy makes a huge difference, because it not only gives people income, but it also actually getting back to work, sense of normality, purpose, those sorts of things. So it feeds into the social well-being as well. And then enhancement and regeneration. Again, I think if you're familiar with Christchurch today versus what it was 15 years ago, it's, in my opinion, a much better city, because we were lucky enough to have quite a lot of funding poured into it. And the final thing in the context, as I've set up there, it's the CDM role is about leadership and coordination. It's not about needing to do everything, but just making sure all the dots are joined up, which is different from your usual council services. And so just thinking about where we're at in terms of recovery, and there's what I regard as a recovery maturity model, based on some work I did before I took up my role, going from unaware through to fully ready, or as ready as you'll ever be. So the first bit, being aware of what it's about, having a basic plan, and I'd say this is very much in the basic plan category. A full plan to me is that you've got you've actually thought about the resources you need to run your plan. You've got your training, your exercises done, all that sort of stuff, and then fully testing it in exercises and experienced. At a group level, I would say we're probably about a 2 out of 10 at the moment. So that's and that was reinforced for me. So with the fires, we're wanting staff. The staff I got were great, but they'd never done recovery before. They weren't trained. So we're having to work through everything as we went through it. Sorry, what's that?
For that recovery, where did those staff come from? Did they come from ECAN or from? A mixture of ECAN and Christchurch City. So the fire was largely in Christchurch City, and although it was a group declaration, so I was involved, and we got some staff out of ECAN, and then also some. But it peaked at probably 5 people for 3 days. So it was actually a pretty small team, and that's, I think, all we needed for that event, because recovery isn't actually a big issue for it, compared with, perhaps other flooding events and so on.
My question too, you said 2 out of 10 for readiness. Is that resourcing and experience driven, or because it's a very low number?
Yeah, look, it is a very low number, and in some of the subsequent slides we might flesh it out a bit more, but particularly for a large event, the governance structures are very unclear. What's civil defence? The Act says that I can't be inconsistent with anything from the National Recovery Manager, and similarly your local recovery managers need to be consistent with whatever directions I give at the group level. But at the same time, you've got councils, and you've got all sorts of other agencies. And as we've seen, in the earthquakes, we had the Christchurch Earthquake Recovery Authority. With the extreme weather events in the North Island, we've got the Cyclone Recovery Unit created. Some people would have argued that actually it should be the National Emergency Management Agency is in charge when it comes to government. So even at that national level, it's really unclear, and it tends to be bespoke arrangements get invented on the day. And that's probably one of the key things that I'd like to work through, not just with yourselves, but through the joint committee, which is the mayors and Ngāi Tahu, is getting really clear about what's the governance structure, the management structure, how are we going to run it? Because I think if you can be clear on that, then you're clear about the accountabilities and who's in charge.
So can I tease that out a bit more?
Yep, sure.
So it's only just over a decade ago we had So it's just over a decade ago we had a major earthquake, and surely we're higher than 2 following that event, or have we just sat on our laurels? Because recovery is still going on up there, and I'm just sort of interested why it's so low. I'm just fascinated by that.
I think there's a number of things in that. My personal experience with Christchurch earthquakes, after the September earthquakes, in fact both earthquakes, I was working in Christchurch City Council. I had a little piece down at the bottom of my job description that said, in a major event, you'll be recovery manager. There were 4 of us with that in our job descriptions. We thought, well, that's never going to happen. It was a bit of a rude shock. But what actually happened when we started to do our jobs is we were asked not to do that by the chief executive because of some of the politics around it. And so after the February earthquakes, we then started to, we actually advocated for the Christchurch Earthquake Recovery Authority, and they took over. And there's a lot of people who I personally know who I think did a fantastic job in that and have got a lot of experience. But the way, again, in the floods last year, anybody who was involved in Sarah was persona non grata in Wellington because there was some stigma attached to it. They thought they hadn't done a good job. So I think in some ways we're not actually valuing the experience that has been gained. And I think now particularly with large parts of the North Island being in recovery, and all sorts of questions being asked, and lots of different structures and models of how they organise themselves. I think now it's dawning on people, actually, at national level, we need to do better. Yeah, so there's lots of layers of human behaviour and politics going on. Yeah. There are a number of diagrams like this that can, available, but it just highlights again in terms of the nature and the context of recovery that as time goes on, the media interest drops away, the understanding, the will, the commitment to do stuff drops away, and that community starts to get frustrated and angry, and why isn't stuff happening quicker, and so on. Again, an example, sorry to keep harping back to the earthquakes, but I had a discussion with somebody 6 weeks after the September earthquakes in Christchurch, and they said, why, they lived in West Christchurch, why are people in East Christchurch still complaining the earthquake was 6 weeks ago? If you're in East Christchurch, you didn't have sewage, you're having to go out into the street to share a shower, that sort of stuff. There's just worlds apart. But if you're not actually in the thick of it, people often move on fairly quickly. And then at a personal level, it's often a bit of a roller coaster as well. And this will look different for everybody. Some people will initially do well and then go into that disillusionment. Some people go straight into disillusionment and then come out more quickly. Some people might go down and actually never fully recover. So there's all sorts of personal experiences. And as a recovery manager, you're needing to try and manage that at a community level. It's also a real balancing act because people are impatient to get things done and you want to do things quickly and you're trying to move things along. At the same time, it's often, when you lift up the hood, it's often a lot more complex than you think. And so trying to figure out what is the right thing to do. How do you deal with that complexity, but yet communicate that simply and clearly to people? How are you going to fund stuff? How do you do stuff without causing other problems down the line? So there's lots of things that you try and you're trying to balance, and so there's a bit of a scales or a seesaw that you need to think about and manage. And whatever you do, of course, as you as councillors know, there'll always be some people who don't like it. That's not news to you, right? Yeah. So this draft plan, from my perspective, is a first step, and part of it is actually just the opportunity to come and talk to you about it and start to raise the profile and start people thinking about how we might do things in an emergency, particularly a large or catastrophic event. So, as you can see up there, you're trying to build that shared understanding, trying to get that commitment to the roles and responsibilities and get some clarity around that. Thinking about where do you get the people and the funding to get started? Because usually what happens is say that the response finishes, the response teams are exhausted, they think job done, and poor Andrew and Paul and their teams are going, well, now it's on us, as well as trying to do your day jobs and all those sorts of things. So being really aware of it's actually a heck of a lot of work. And it will go on for a long time. So getting that sustainability Funding's a really interesting one. Again, in the Hawke's Bay, a couple of the councils I was dealing with up there were saying, well, they'll be insolvent within 12 days if they continued at their current rate of spending. So in that case, the government came in, but as you're going through your LTPs and so on, thinking what is that financial headroom that we've got, and I know it's a really, really difficult process, but it's something to keep in mind. Yeah, indeed. Yeah. There's no easy answers, I'm afraid. Well, not from me, anyway. And secondly, in terms of the plan, is trying to identify a program of work that we need to do to enhance that readiness, and then scheduling and training exercises. So just some things to keep in mind in terms of recovery. That coordination is a key part of it. A lot of recovery actually occurs outside of civil defence and relies on goodwill rather than formal powers. So as recovery manager at the group level and your local recovery managers, and Andrew and Paul, we've got the power to evacuate buildings, close roads, demolish things, all that sort of stuff. But actually very little of that is about recovery. A lot of that is about continuing to protect lives and infrastructure and stopping people going back into dangerous places, like those sorts of things. So the actual recovery often falls back on using existing powers under the Local Government Act, under the RMA, and so on. And unless there's special legislation passed, which in a big event there may well be. Spoke before about that understanding roles and responsibilities, because for me, even as a group recovery manager, where does my role finish? When does it finish? And when do we hand stuff back into some modified BAU arrangement with councils or other agencies? And that's quite unclear. But without getting that clarity early on, it can be very inefficient. At the group level, the top of the tree is a joint committee, which is, as I said, the mayors. That's a legislated committee under the Civil Defence Act. Alongside them, or not alongside them, reporting to them or advising them, is also the KEG, which is the Coordinating Executives Group. So that's where all the executives are on, the chief executives of district councils, along with senior representatives from police and FENS and St John's and so on. For a large event, I'm proposing that if it's a Canterbury-wide event, a recovery board. And for me, this is primarily advisory rather than actually decision-making. And more than anything, it's providing me with the advice and support that I need, because in my experience, I don't think I would be able to get that from the Joint Committee in the way that I need it. So during a crisis event, all of you, if it affects your district, will be flat out. You'll be engaging with your community, doing whatever you can to help them. And what I need in my role is some people who know some stuff about recovery and the context in which it's happening, and can step back out of that and probably spend half a day at a time chewing through what are we going to do about this, helping problem solve and so on. So it's very much about augmenting the capacity and giving me the support that I need, so that our advice to the Joint Committee is as good as it can be. That's the intention with that, and that'll be going back for some further discussion around what that looks like. And then at the local council level, clearly governance sits around this table with yourselves.
Sorry, I might have missed this, but just on the last slide, you had this plan is for a large or catastrophic event. What kind of process do you go through? Like, do you just kind of know, or do you sit there and go, you know, it's this size, it's this scale, it's this many councils, we need to enact this plan?
Sure. So I think for it to be, to revert to this plan, it would probably, first of all, need to be bigger than a single council could manage on their own. Or it may be span across many councils. And again, I think the main things are you able to handle it yourselves? Or even if it's multiple councils, if they're all able to work on it, that's easy. And in a what I'd describe as perhaps a moderate size event, which perhaps the 2021 floods, that involved a number of councils, and I wasn't in this role at that time. I would probably be more active in recovery than the group office was at the time. But that would be very much around supporting the local recovery managers and coordinating across districts and coordinating and advocating into central government about funding issues and those sorts of things. Leaving your councils and your teams to probably be doing most of the stuff on the ground. If you need more resources, then that's something you request of me, and I scramble around and see what we can get from either other parts of Canterbury, or kick it up to national and see what we can get from other parts of the country. So in terms of where does it sit, where this would really kick in, I think for me, would be clearly something like AF8, or a large tsunami, which might also be associated, if it's associated with something like Hikurangi. It's actually a really scary scenario because most of the North Island's in munted as well, so we wouldn't be getting support from them. Or it might be even a really severe weather event, bigger than probably the 2021 floods, but you know, something as I had in Auckland or Hawke's Bay, but over a bigger area. Or for another example might be one that in my personal opinion, we haven't thought about enough, and that might be a malicious infrastructure attack. So, you know, if you get a sustained attack that takes out your internet, pretty much everything shuts down, you know, including your electricity supplies and all sorts of other things. And that could, you know, that can be absolutely paralysing if that went on for a sustained period.
That sort of feels to me, the way it's written, is your local governance is probably going to be set up and running before your group is. That's the way that reads. Maybe I'm reading it wrong. You know, just the words of recovery board as proposed. Well, actually, we should know that well before now. Because your local... Oh, sorry. I keep forgetting to turn the green on. So I'm just sort of interested in the dynamics there.
Yeah, so what I would like to see is us identify perhaps a pool of maybe 20 people who might, and then ahead of an event, and have discussions about who those people might be. And then if we're using that recovery board, you know, maybe it's 8 of them, depending on who's available and the nature of the event. And so that we can pull them together quite quickly. I think there needs to be some discussion, about who those people might be, who convenes them, how quickly do we bring them together. So there's some definitely more discussion required around that and how it works. But I think what I'll be wanting to do is certainly bring them together while we're still in the response phase, still in that state of emergency, which in a large event may go on for, several weeks. Now, this is a rather horrendous diagram. Apologies for it, and the next iteration of this plan will be much simpler. But I'll even with glasses, it doesn't look much better. I'll just try and talk about some key elements of it. So I've spoken about the joint committee at the bottom there, with the mayors, the chair of Environment Canterbury and Ngāi Tahu. Going up from that to the left is the recovery board that I've spoken about, and I've put if required. For me, as I said, they're probably mainly an advisory board rather than actually having an authority. Then a group recovery office above them. So wherever it says group in civil defence, it's regional, is what it talks about. That's the language used in the Act. And it's made up of people like myself from Christchurch, who have that regional perspective, and all the individual councils. The way we organise ourselves in recovery is actually different from the way it's organised in response. So those recovery task groups, also called sector groups, also called recovery environment groups, depending on which document you read, and they tend to be representatives of particular environments or sectors. So as you can see in there, there's a natural environment, there's a social environment, there's the economic environment, there's built, and I think it's also probably that we would want to have a rural environment for most events in Canterbury, because that's because of the nature of our economy. And so they are groups with all the key players within that particular sector or environment. So in the social one, for example, you will have quite a few government departments who are heavily involved with that. You'd probably also have people like your rural support trusts who are providing support, and other NGOs in there. In the natural environment, you'd probably have the likes of Environment Canterbury, Department of Conservation and others, and so on and so forth. So, and that's actually where most of the coordination gets done. In the fires, we've set up one, and that's actually an environmental one, because most of the issues from the fires are actually about the natural environment and sedimentation coming down into rivers and loss of vegetation and stuff. There's not a big social impact at this point. Other events, social can be huge, economic can be huge, built can be huge. So what they are is they're bringing together the key players, in a room like this, so you can talk and coordinate across the different agencies involved. And at the regional level, the group office will be trying to facilitate those, bring them together, provide support in terms of secretarial support and program management and so on. Whether they get duplicated at a local level is a question, and it's a live question, because a lot of the government departments are not going to be wanting to do that in every district if it was a Canterbury-wide thing. So it may be, in fact, we have regional or sub-regional groups. In terms of council's involvement, actually you're involved at a whole lot of different levels. Clearly you're involved at that joint committee level through your mayor, In the group office, we will be working very closely, as we have just in the last few weeks with the fires, with local councils. You'll be making your own decisions, hopefully in a coordinated way through the structure. But, if it comes to spending your money or you're making decisions, it's your money. So, what you spend it on, what you prioritise, ultimately stays with you. The central government will also be involved at a number of levels as well, through their own departments, but also ministers and prime ministers taking an interest. The question about Ngāi Tahu involvement is a really interesting one. So in that diagram off on the left, I've got the Ngāi Tahu and Māori Recovery Rōpū. The intention of that is not everything Ngāi Tahu or Māori gets put to this group. That group is there to identify who they want representing them in some of those different parts of the structure, because that's somewhere, having worked for Ngāi Tahu for a couple of years, it's not somewhere I want to go and venture into that. I think Ngāi Tahu are a very political organisation in themselves, and who's in charge is up to them to decide who they want represent, who's mana whenua, and that's not just going to happen at the office of Turunanga or Ngāi Tahu in Christchurch. It has to be local. So there's multiple levels in which they're involved. And I've had some discussions with Ngāi Tahu around this, but there's a lot more discussion needs to happen. Most of the rest of the slides are probably, I'll flick through them, but they're actually sort of covering some of the things I've just spoken about in terms of some of the groups shown there. But also this one just talking about local versus group office. So local, leading that engagement with your local communities, that local coordination, connecting and advocating interregional and national initiatives. You'll be doing some of your own operational activity, and I say such as welfare, that's something that will, in many events, carry on from the response phase, where you have civil defence centres where people can go if they're needing accommodation, or working through other agencies, and restoring your own services as part of that. At the group level, it's that coordination at that regional level. A big part of it is advocacy and funding to central government, trying to make sure that they get the message clearly. Stuff like policy advice, which requires or would benefit from a regionally consistent approach. So an example of that at the moment playing out in the North Island is the what's called FOSL, which is future of severely affected land, in other words, buyout or managed retreat from areas, and the government has come up with a proposal, 50-50 funding split, but there's a whole lot of policy around how do you actually do that, and different categories of homes affected, and what if somebody's insured versus somebody who's not insured, and just it's an absolute minefield. Doing that at every council doing that on their own, to me, is a colossal waste of time and money and effort. There are big legal bills associated with it. Doing it collectively, and say this is what we're proposing. You'll still have to make the decision, but at least we're not duplicating all that sort of effort. So those are some of the things that I see being done in the regional office. And then supporting local activities, and that might be, if you need staff to support, seeing what we can get from elsewhere.
Which means you have to have quite a visible regional group.
Yep.
With strong relationships, because I can just imagine, once that put, say, a funding bid up to Crown and it comes back and the local don't like it, there's going to be tension there as well. So that's going to have to be thought through as to, is every local bound by whatever comes their way? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It does get, those relationships are very important, and being able to have some fairly honest discussions become important. But also I think just being really clear and utilising all the connections we possibly can to influence government, so that, you know, you might have a discussion with a minister, and he might, she might say, yes, that's great, but actually it can often be scuppered by officials underneath and the advice that they give. So trying to think about what other channels do we have to influence officials who might be providing the advice as well. So those are the sorts of things that I think, particularly actually a recovery board can be really useful if you've got people who are well connected in those circles.
Yeah, one of the things is the ministerial relationships as well with the Prime Minister, you know, because when it's a regional event and crosses many districts, each district tends to start competing for the funding and the exposure as well. So there's different invitations come out and ministers go visiting different areas. So there needs to be coordination in that, because at the end of the day, we're all competing for the same pot of funding.
And just feeding on Andrew's point, every fortnight I have a conversation with my counterparts nationally online for an hour. And one of the things about that is Canterbury is perceived as wealthy compared with some other parts of the country. And I was just out there before we came in, I was talking about something like Wairoa, for example, where the average income is 65% of the national average. Insurance levels were 50%, which is incredibly low. 80% of the houses had asbestos in them. So those sorts of things, you'd expect that they would get a higher level of government assistance than we might hear. And so there are those sorts of things that we do need to be cognizant of, but equally we want to be proactive and in there early, advocating as best we can for the people of Canterbury. I've spoken a little bit about the Recovery Board. Although I've labelled it a governance there, actually part of it for me is also probably in some cases would be tactical advice for myself in terms of getting stuff done. So I think it probably spans both. And membership to be decided. Recovery task groups, I've spoken about them. So these are the multi-agency groups that you pull together so you can have those conversations. Spoken about this particular rōpū in terms of helping determine where and how Ngāi Tahu and Māori interests are represented. And you can ignore the 1st of December, that was last year. But I'm very happy to receive feedback because we're still working on the next iteration of this document. Happy to answer any further questions.
Thank you for your presentation. AF8, some would say we're overdue, some would say it's definitely coming. Where are we in the preparation for AF8?
Yep, good question. So at the group level, there's a guy, Matt Clark, who's been doing some work around preparation, particularly for response. So we also have a national exercise coming up in June, July, called Ruwhenua. And then later on in the year, we're going to have another exercise, our usually annual exercise, Pandora, will also be based around that scenario. So there's certainly a lot of work going on at a number of levels to identify what the issues are. In terms of how prepared is your council, I will leave that for them to answer.
I'm happy to add to that. Yeah, definitely there's been a lot of work going on around AF8. Last year, particularly a series of workshops with all our agencies and stakeholders. Some really productive stuff that came out of there. Actually, much of that was understanding what we didn't really understand. And then, like Richard said, the focus this year is really pulling that together and exercising it so that we've got a better picture of it all. So it's definitely ongoing. It's just probably about putting a lot of those strands together now.
Yeah, I think from a response perspective, yes, there's a lot of work going on. From a recovery perspective, probably not so much, because there's going to be a long haul. We've seen that with just Christchurch. AF8 will be far bigger than that. And it will be years. There will be supply chain issues for a long time. And funding is going to be a major exercise. Yeah. So yeah, that's the bit that probably needs to be a bit more thought into.
So you're really focused on the Canterbury-wide initiative. So when, I presume at our local level, we have a event recovery plan in place, or we don't?
Hello, how are you? Look, I don't think we have a specific recovery plan in place at the moment, and I think that what Richard is touching on is the understanding that a lot of our preparation has been around that response sort of period, and I think this is a point that we need to start looking forward to that recovery and understand what that looks like. We've increased our recovery managers, for example, so I think that that's a good step in the right direction. And the exercises for AF8 that we've talked about will have a focus on recovery, or at least won't just be around the initial response phase. It'll sort of, we'll exercise a few days later as well, which is a really important thing to get our head. Day one is probably not our challenge, day 5 is our challenge, and it's understanding that and getting on top of that.
So we talk about funding, but I'm not sure the funding sits there ready. And if we're going to be doing recovery, surely that's one of the things we're going to have to start sorting out earlier, well, nowish, because, you know, the councils have got headroom, but that won't last long if you've got a alpine fault, and probably the earthquake recovery fund's probably pretty well exhausted from Christchurch. So I think there's a bigger conversation to be had from central government, local government, all the way down. And is that actually happening, or is that, all right, it happens, let's now just go out and acquire stuff and worry about paying for it later?
It's a combination, it's a combination of things. I mean, we've got someone from LGFA coming shortly. It's, you know, increasing your ability to borrow within those things. I mean, it could be overnight, you know, a stroke of a pen could actually enable another $100 million, whether you want it or not.
But someone's still got to have that thought before.
Yeah, no, totally. So, yeah, but what local authority wants, you know, it'll be fascinating watching those central, and I would say they're actually pretty lined up. They had strong relationships, some of those ones in Central Hawke's Bay, in a pretty good place, but they still weren't comfortable with what they got from central government. So that's going to be ongoing for years and years, but it'll be fascinating watching just their rate increases, et cetera, and their ability for their communities to pay. We're lucky we're actually on a low rating base. Look at Kaikoura as an example. You know, after their earthquake, what did they make a decision to jump up 20 or 30% or something? But at the time, the community said, yeah, we'll do that because this is exactly what we need to do. So, yeah, I mean, I see the challenge in it, but I don't think it's, you know, insurmountable.
I think, yeah, the environment has changed a lot in recent times as councils head up towards their debt limits, or, you know, and it's right across the board, across the whole country. We know that it's an issue with infrastructure. so previously. So I think, yeah, there probably does need to be a little bit of work on that debt area because, you know, you take the Nelson flood event, that was $80 million. Yeah, that was a phenomenal hit. And of course, the change in government policy now is any sort of red zone land, it's now 50-50 share. Councils pay 50% of it. So it's, yeah, there's certainly emerging, I think, yeah, perhaps a little bit more work there needs to go on, perhaps talking with funding agencies.
You'd think they have had a conversation, the funding agencies, to some extent. Surely they must see, I mean, they've got a range of councils that are, you know, over those covenants at the moment as far as, you know, they're above 2.8, the larger council. So, you know, there must be something that's had a conversation above our pay grade, I would hope.
I was simply going to add that we are on a maturity journey and we're right at the very beginning of it in terms of recovery. So we've all been all whiz-bang, jazz hands and all the rest of it around response for a few years. And we're not too shabby, in Canterbury in particular, in terms of response, but we're a long, long way from being fit for, or match fit in terms of recovery. But I think that's the whole country. And as Richard has alluded to, I think we're probably a 2 out of 10. But we are trying to make steps towards it, and funding of it that'll be a component of it. But again, we're pretty immature about all that stuff in terms of what recovery really means until we're in the thick of it. It seems to be how we're operating at the moment, yeah.
But in answering probably Councillor Scott's question about recovery planning, that the recovery plans are actually written day 2 of the response effectively. So yeah, and each event is different. I've been through a few of them now, written a recovery plan or 2. But yeah, they are different. They have different focuses. Yeah, sometimes it's about people and property. Other times it's about the environment or economic. And I think economic is one that tends to get overlooked a bit. Yeah, but businesses are incredibly important.
Yeah, I might just chuck in a couple of comments. First of all, going back to the issue of funding, I think the North Island severe weather event has, because it affected so much of the New Zealand population, I think it's bumped that visibility up a bit in terms of both central government, but also anything that affects Auckland, for example, is a big chunk of New Zealand. So I think within central government, I think there's now much more awareness than there was, and there seems to be much more appetite. The Minister, for example, asking the NEMA about recovery, not just about response. Also, there have been a number of discussions within Wellington among government departments about how they're going to respond to a major event, particularly ones that affect Wellington. And that's been a real eye-opener, I think, for a lot of the chief executives of government departments who initially thought it was alarmist, but now they're actually getting a sense, well, hang on, this could be really catastrophic. And with something like the Hikurangi subduction zone off the lower North Island, major earthquake, but also a big tsunami, and the modelling for that is about 40,000 dead. So you know, when you start to get into that scenario, you start to really get a sense of how precarious this may be. And so I think that there is an increasing awareness of both the practicalities and the funding and all the other things that go with it.
I do worry how serious people take it after our COVID pandemic around modelling. You know, this country got killed with data and modelling, and did it eventuate? Some would say no. So it's a really tricky position to be in when you start modelling and not scaremongering, that's because it's real, but you know, like, it's very tricky going forward, I think, in this country.
Yeah, and it might be 50 years away, or it might be next Tuesday, and you just don't know.
can we make it the Tuesday after, 26th? 4 hours of council meeting, so that'd be ideal.
We've learned that Richard has the capability to kill a lot of things, so maybe he should come to the 26th of March.
There again, just to maybe end us on a positive note, if you look at, trying to find a positive in this conversation, but, if you go to Christchurch, look at, what's risen from the ashes, and, there's some horror stories in behind it, but actually it's a community that's turned themselves around and done pretty well. So, yeah, on that note, let's, no. But, I mean, that's it. It's communities coming together, isn't it? And I did like the slide on the, the hero and all that, and then it's like, oh, it's day 5 that the communities, no one plans past day 3. That's when people run out of food and all those sort of things. So, that's challenging our role, isn't it, around that education piece and actually getting people ready. Yeah.
How many of us in here already?
What's that?
How many of us sitting around the table?
We're
already?
just going to go out to our local potato farmer.
Let's